Good afternoon. Welcome to LBMA webinars. Today we're talking about REACH, what you need to know, what you need to do, and future developments throughout the years. We have 4 panelists joining us today. We have Braibant, the LBMA REACH consultant, Emmy Richardson, LBMA's compliance analyst. We have Frederik, Johanson, partner at REACHLaw, and we have Silvia Segna, the senior chemicals policy executive at CIA, not that CIA. Before I hand over the floor to our panelists, I'm just going to take you through a quick housekeeping slide. We would welcome your questions throughout the webinar. So if you do have any, please drop them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or at the top, depending on which version you're using. We'll either answer them throughout the webinar or towards the end. If you are listening to this as a recorded webinar, we will ask you to email ask@lbma.org.uk and we will send those questions across to the panelists. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Carolyn to the stage.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Hello, everybody. Nice to imagine you there because I don't see you. It's a pleasure to be here with very nice speakers to take you through the very wonderful world of REACH, wonderful between brackets, of course. What we would like to do really is to take you very quickly around the REACH world, because you have EU REACH, but you have more than that. In particular, then Frederik Johanson will take us through UK REACH, what you need to know, what you need to do. And after a little pause, what we can anticipate as future developments. And then Silvia and I will actually talk about REACH today versus REACH tomorrow to understand a bit what we think we know today, which actually still may change. And after that, Taylor will join us again for the conclusion and the closure. So welcome again. And with these little words, I would really just go to the, REACH around the world. So as I said, it all started around 10 years ago in the EU with the EU REACH, but actually over time, a number of REACH schemes have been populating around the world. It started with South Korea REACH, Turkey REACH, and actually over time, we have seen also popping up India, China and Taiwan REACH, more recently Eurasia REACH, and following the Brexit, the UK had to set up its own REACH system called UK REACH. In addition to these REACH-like systems, it's important to note that there are also many other chemical, inventory, risk determination, and listing initiatives around the world. You have those in Australia, you have those in Canada, United States, and also Latin America is developing an increasing number of schemes similar to I would say, the US and the REACH systems. So whatever we do under EU REACH and UK REACH has an importance beyond, I would say, this small continent of the EU. Now, what is important to note is that, unfortunately, all schemes, all these REACH-like schemes have different thresholds. So some of them you have to register as from 1 kilogram, others you have to register as from 1 ton. They have different scopes. In some cases, substances are in, others are out. You have different data requirements depending on tonnages, and also you have different types of submission formats and softwares that you can use. Added to that, you have different registration deadlines, which is more understandable considering that you have these systems coming up little by little. The operational systems today, basically those where a law has been passed and is in action, are EU, South Korea, Turkey, China, Taiwan, and more recently UK REACH. And those which are still developing with no final legal act out yet is India REACH and Eurasia REACH. What is important to note is that despite differences and the complexity in these differences, there is a commonality across all these systems, and it is that they actually all use the same hazard data set. So basically everything that is intrinsic to the chemical and doesn't change depending on where you are on the planet can be generated and reused across all the systems. And this is basically the physical properties, toxicological properties, and ecotoxicological properties. Anything else you are familiar with under EU REACH, for example, the exposure assessments, the risk assessments, that would have to be done locally, unfortunately. But well, at least we have something to start with, and we don't need to repeat all these studies on our substances around the world. Normally, we can reuse what we have performed under EU REACH in all these other systems. So with this, I just wanted to give a bit of good news as well. There are typical steps around these REACH systems. You typically have a very early stage that is called pre-registration or notification. From this, the authorities set up an inventory of chemicals. They basically map what is on their market. Once this is available, then you are bound to a registration or notification obligation, depending on the classification of your substance or the tonnage band. And then once all the information is submitted to the authorities, they perform an evaluation or a risk determination. Different jargon is utilized here. And because it all starts with the intrinsic properties data, typically this is accompanied by an agreed classification or a recommended classification. And then if you have a bad classification, typically the authorities may recommend a number of restrictions, like, for example, maximum exposure levels in the workplace, concentration limits in products, for example, or also emission limits to the environment. All this is really a collective work, a group exercise, and I think that the speakers we have today really show, except for the authorities who were not available today but will be available next time, it really shows that we need to work together on this one. There's a lot of individual homework to be done by companies. A number of things are not known by anybody but yourself. Then there's collective homework, because you actually have to submit all together the information to authorities. This is actually to avoid a number of repeated tests, but also to minimize costs in principle. And then you have also a lot of work that needs to be done through your associations, because they require advocacy that can only be done if you have a trustee in place who can collect information from the entire value chain and bring that to the deciding authorities. So luckily, everything we have learned through the last years of REACH, these typical steps, has equipped us to go through and navigate through these steps for the other schemes as well. Luckily, we're not yet in the last 3 boxes for UK REACH. As you will see, as presented by Frederik, we're really at the beginning. We just finalized the pre-registration notification stage, which is reopened ad hoc for those who haven't done it yet. And the UK authorities are actually looking at how to set up the inventory and the registration and notification approaches that you can see in this slide. So with this, I would like to give the floor to Frederik to give us a very good description about what we need to know more in detail and especially what we need to do on UK REACH. Thank you, Frederik.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you also to the organizers for asking me to step in on behalf of the, or not on behalf, but instead of the authorities. So I'm not an authority, I'm just a regular consultant, but I do know something about UK REACH and the other REACH-like chemical regulations. So happy to be here today to tell you about the basics, essentially about UK REACH, and also what's it developing into. And I will focus mostly on the registration part, because that affects most of you companies who place chemicals on the UK market, or to be more precise, the British market. But I'll come back to that. So next slide, please. So just briefly, my name is Frederik Johanson. I'm a partner and head of sales at REACHLaw. I'm a chemical engineer by background. Have been working with EHS and chemical regulatory topics for most of my professional career that now I think is almost 18 years long. Time flies indeed. Next slide, please. So we have an agenda within an agenda here today. So just thought I'd give you a quick overview of REACHLaw, so where we come from. So who are we here to talk about UK REACH? What do we know, and so forth. And then, of course, go into the basics of the UK REACH regulation, then look at the current requirements, and then also look at what's coming around the corner, so future developments. And I think we will have a Q&A at the end, but if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comment or the question form. Next slide, please. So looking at REACHLaw, next slide, please. So we provide support for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations globally. So everything started with EU REACH, as Caroline mentioned, more than 10 years ago for us. But now, as time has passed, EU REACH has actually been copied across several jurisdictions. So now we can expand upon our services and provide expertise also for these other chemical regulations, which are very similar to EU REACH. So now today, obviously, we'll talk about UK REACH, but for example, the Turkey KKDAK regulation is also essentially a copy of the EU REACH regulation. Then in India, we have something that's still brewing, as also Caroline had it in her slides. That's something that's not coming into force this year, I'm afraid, but maybe next year. There have been some postponements in that regard, but we'll see when it enters into force. And then, of course, K-REACH Korea, which is already in force, in full force, so to speak. Next slide, please. So just to show you where we have our offices and where we can actually provide local support, meaning become, for example, an only representative. So for EU REACH, we provide services through our head office here in Finland. But for UK REACH, we have an office in Manchester. We have 6 people at the moment at our office in Manchester, through which we obviously then provide these OR services. Then we have a small office also in Brussels, New Delhi, and then a bigger one in Turkey, because that is a very active phase at the moment. Next slide, please. So we really specialize in chemical regulatory compliance and sustainability. And if you like, we also have a YouTube channel where we put all our webinars, and we have a lot of webinars. So I invite you to have a look at REACHLaw Talks. There's a lot of content and more coming all the time. Also on UK REACH, actually. So coming to the core, if you will, of this presentation. So that is UK REACH and some of the quick facts and basics. So next slide, please. So I think we all know already that the UK REACH regulation has entered into force, and it entered into force last year, beginning of January. And it is a copy of the EU REACH regulation for many practical reasons, because all the as part of the Brexit, the most EU regulations as such were transformed into UK law, and this also applied to the EU REACH regulation. So today, the EU REACH regulation essentially, the UK REACH regulation essentially means the EU regulation as end of 2020, plus a number of statutory instruments that essentially define how it is entering into force, what are the so-called transitional measures, and what text bits are to be replaced. For example, the chemical agency will be replaced by the HSE and so forth. And also the implementing regulations that I think most of us are quite well aware that have been working with EU REACH, like the data sharing implementation regulation, that is also in force in the UK to support the UK REACH regulation. At the moment, as far as I know, there's still no consolidated legal text for this UK REACH regulation, and it is quite tedious to actually read per se, because you have to jump around between different statutory instruments and so forth, and always refer back to the EU REACH regulatory text. But I'm sure there will be a consolidated version at one point. So next slide, please. So really the important consequences of the UK REACH regulation entering into force is that, well, a GB-based manufacturer is still a GB-based manufacturer under UK REACH. The same goes for a GB-based importer sourcing from outside of the EU or the European Economic Area. They're still a GB-based importer under UK REACH. However, where the biggest changes come is where we had GB-based downstream users who were using chemicals that they were sourcing from the EU, because under EU REACH, they didn't have to do anything. They essentially had to comply with downstream user requirements and information in the safety data sheets and such. But now, as of 1st of January 2021, so last year, they have now suddenly become importers into Great Britain. And why I'm always saying Great Britain and not the UK is because Northern Ireland is actually still within the realm of the EU REACH regulation, with the only exception that you can be an UK REACH only representative based in Northern Ireland. Other than that, essentially, all these requirements apply in Great Britain and not the whole of UK. And there was a talk about why isn't it called GB REACH, and the reason is because these there are certain possibilities to become an OR in Northern Ireland for UK REACH. So that's why it's UK REACH. So So for these GB-based importers, those are the companies, those are the actors who essentially have the biggest impact of UK reach, especially for the registration part. So if you take the next slide, please. And just to quickly discuss that when you worked with EU reach, you always were had as a counterparty, if you will, the European Chemical Agency for all whether you submitted your dossier, made pre-registrations, notifications, and whatnot. In the UK, it's the HSC. So that is the ECHA of the UK REACH regulation, if you will. And they have set up an IT system called Comply with the UK REACH, through which you are supposed to submit most of these dossiers that you are submitting on behalf of UK REACH, like submitting a downstream user import notification, an inquiry, a co-registration, lead registration, and so forth. So next slide, please. So that was like really the quick basics, just barely scratched the surface, but I think that covers the most important part. So now looking at the current requirements, what you need to know and do essentially. So next slide, thank you. So here we have the main requirements of the UK REACH regulation. And as you can see, these are the same requirements as you have for EU REACH. So for substances that you are placing on the GB market at 1 ton or more, you need to register unless they're exempt. So there's the same no data, no market clause applies. Then for certain substances of very high concern that are included in an authorization list, you have to apply for an authorization for specific uses of the substance. This is the Annex 14. So the same annex as we have for EU REACH. Then also you need to comply with restrictions according to Annex 17. Use your substance according to the safe guidance provided in safety data sheets and other documents like in authorizations, in authorization conditions and so forth. So this applies to the downstream users. And then you also need to communicate information about substances of very high concern, for example, in articles to recipients of the articles. So this is these are the main requirements. And today we will focus on the registration because that applies to most of you, I guess. So next slide, please. Next, yeah, thank you. So these are the registration and related deadlines. So as you can see, some of them have already passed. And this is now a very important note that this is based on the current legal text. So what is currently in the legal text. So essentially it says that if you are placing so-called non-existing supply substances, come back to the definition in the next slide, then you will have to register these before you place them on the GB market at 1 ton or more. I'll come back to what this special case is a bit later. However, if you had already registered for EU REACH, so you were a manufacturer in the UK, in Great Britain, or imported into Great Britain from outside of the EU or the European Economic Area substances that you had registered, then you were able to grandfather those in. And this deadline for submitting this first part of the grandfathering application registration was end of April last year, so just coming up on 1 year ago. Then the latest deadline to be passed, albeit this has been extended, is the downstream user import notification deadline. And this applies to companies who used to be downstream users, but now suddenly have become importers, or then they are only representatives. So they have to submit the so-called doing a downstream import user import notification. And the deadline was end of October last year, but the HSC has extended this deadline for the time being. So we don't know when this opportunity to submit late doings is coming to an end. So this downstream user import notification is a basic requirement for you to be able to benefit from these transitional timelines, meaning that if you are placing a so-called existing supply substance on the GB market and you are an importer from the EU, then you must downstream user import notify by the deadline or now as soon as possible to benefit from these transitional measures. I'll come back to this in the next slide. But today we also, according to the current legal text, we have 3 subsequent registration deadlines. So these are very similar to what we had for EU REACH, except there are small differences. But for the high tonnage band substances, the first registration deadline used to be, I'll come back to what it will be in the future, hopefully. It used to be end of 2023, October end of 2023 for these high tonnage band substances and substances, so-called very toxic to aquatic organisms at over 100 tons per year, or then these very nasty carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reproductive toxic substances, as well as substances on the candidate list at 1 ton or more. Then the second registration deadline in 25, end of October 25, was for 100 to 1,000 ton substances, and then these substances that have been added to the candidate list after UK REACH regulation has entered into force at 1 ton or more. And then all the rest, so the smaller tonnage bands, all the way in 2027. So these are the current legal text requirements, and these the doing and the registration deadlines are under these transitional measures. So if you are not eligible as providing existing supply substances, then you cannot benefit from these transitional measures, and you have to register immediately. So if you come to the next slide, please.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to make maybe a little clarification here that actually for the substances we are looking at, which are basically gold, silver, platinum, and palladium metal, the relevant registration deadlines would actually be the third registration deadline for all 3 substances except silver, if you look at the tonnages and the classifications. And silver will probably be subject to registration by the first deadline because it has this very toxic to aquatic organisms classification. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. So if you take the next slide, please. So I talked about in the previous slide about this existing supply. So what does it mean? So it means that these transitional measures apply to substances that were in active trade into the UK in 2019 or 2020. And this means at any volumes and substances that are or were subject to EU REACH registration. So it means that if you did not import substances in 2019 or 2020, then you could not benefit from these so-called transitional measures because you would not be considered as being under existing supply. So these companies who are importing or only representative that are under this existing supply, only those could submit a downstream user import notification and thus benefit from these transitional measures. So it's good to understand if you do not abide by these requirements, then you are not subject to these transitional measures. And this becomes quite complicated, especially in cases of only representatives where you are representing importers in Great Britain. For certain substances, you're covering them as an only representative. What it means is that these importers become downstream users from a REACH perspective or distributors, and they do not have to do any registration requirements. However, it only applies if they can only be covered under this doing by the only representative if they are under this existing supply criteria. So it means that if you have certain, as an only representative, have certain companies that were indeed under active trade in 2019 or 20, but some customers who were not, you would actually not be able to cover these companies who were not under active trade in 2019 and 2020 through the only representative, through this doing procedure. You would actually have to register first to be able to cover these companies. So that is quite an important issue to be aware of. But I think in your cases where you are talking about these precious metals, I think most of you did import in 2019 and 2020, so you would be under this existing supply. So all of these transitional measures would apply. If it doesn't apply, then you would have to go through first an inquiry and then submit a registration before placing these substances on the GB markets, in the same way as if there would have been no Brexit. So next slide, please. So the basic requirements for registration is that all substances that are manufactured at 1 ton or more, or imported at 1 ton or more into Great Britain and are not subject to any exemptions from the registration requirement would have to be registered. Either these are done through a so-called grandfathering, which we looked at briefly, or then by submitting so-called new registration. So the tonnage bands are the same, and the data requirements are the same as for EU REACH. So as Caroline already mentioned, most of you for the precious metals, except for silver, you would likely be in the first bracket of 1 to 10, maybe if you're lucky in the 10 to 100. And then for silver, you would be in the higher tonnage bands. So the data requirements increase with the tonnage band. And for these precious metals, I think all of you for EU REACH, for example, register them as full substances, because these are used in various applications, obviously, and not as intermediate. So I will not go into details there. Registrations have to be also done as joint submissions. So it means that you have one registration covering one substance, and different companies take part in the same joint submission. You have one lead registrant, and all the other ones are so-called co-registrants. Also, fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory clauses apply to data sharing and cost sharing as they do for EU REACH. And of course, you need to keep all the information up to date. Next slide, please. So this tries to capture all the different methods of currently registering substances under the UK REACH. So I'll try to go through this really quickly. So if you click the next button. So first we have the grandfathered substances and registrations who also need to take part in the joint registration. So the deadlines here are according to the current legal text. And if you click the next, then we have these transitional registrations who also need to take part in the same joint submission. So if it's the same substance, all of these have to work together as part of the joint registration. And if you click one more time, also companies that are not eligible for these transitional registrations, so they are registering a new substance which was registered previously, but for them, they were not under existing supply. They can submit a so-called NRES, meaning a new registration for existing substance. To do this, they have to submit an inquiry and then a so-called deferred registration. And by doing this, they will also take part in the same joint registration for the same substance as these other actors. So these all processes feed into the same goal, and that is the joint submission of the same substance. So if you click one more time, then we have a very special case whereby we would have a completely new or novel substance which would not have been registered for under EU REACH. Then of course, in these cases, you will have to provide a full data set of the substance, become a lead registrant, submit an inquiry before registering, before you can start placing substances on the UK market. I think this is a very niche case, which probably is not very common. We've not seen one single case of this yet. All the other ones we're working very actively on. So if you take the next slide, please. I will not go into the details except to say that registration fees applies to if you are registering a substance. The only exception is that if you are grandfathering an existing EU REACH registration into UK REACH, then you would not have to pay these registration fees. But in all other cases, these applies. And these are the same in magnitude as the EU REACH registration fees that you paid to the chemical agency ECHA back in the day. So next slide, please. And just a quick note on articles. So the same definition applies obviously in the UK REACH as in the EU REACH. So an article is an object which is during production given a special shape, form, design, and so forth, which determines its function to a greater degree than does its chemical composition. So this is the same requirement, and the same guidance actually applies for UK REACH also as for EU REACH. They don't have yet any own guidance for UK REACH, for example, for articles or registration or anything. They just refer to the ECHA guidance. And just to show you one of these requirements is, for example, if you're notifying substances of very high concern according to Article 7.2, then the same requirements apply as for EU. So you have to notify to the HSC if this SVHC substance is present in the article at 1 ton or more on an annual level, and the substance is then present at the 0.1% concentration level at the weight per weight basis, unless a substance is then registered for that specific use. But in the UK, you haven't registered many substances, so that would not apply. So this is just a quick look at the SVHCs and articles. So these are the same as for EU REACH. So if you take the next slide, please.
Frederik, before we move to the next slide, here again, we have received a question about the LBMA's exemption for gold articles that was obtained under EU REACH.
Yeah.
Basically, what happened in the early stages of EU REACH is that there was recognition that gold and silver bars following a number of specifications would actually fall under the definition of article and therefore would not need to be registered under EU REACH. And as you just explained, Frederik, because the considerations of articles are the same under EU REACH and UK REACH, we can just answer the question to confirm that indeed this exemption or this clarification that has been sought under the EU REACH for gold, silver articles remains under UK REACH. So we are not intending to consider these investment bars as anything but articles, and these do not need to be registered.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Caroline. So if they take the next slide, and sorry, I'm probably going over time already, but this will be quick, the next. So the future developments of the UK REACH regulation. So the DEFRA said actually end of last year that they're committed to exploring alternative arrangements for UK REACH transitional registration requirements in order to support chemical business whilst upholding the highest standards to safeguard public health and environment. So what this means is that they're actually working together with different stakeholders to look at different possibilities to submit registrations under reduced data requirements. So because if you can submit registrations under reduced data requirements, the costs will go down. So what they're trying to avoid here is that you have to pay again for the data that you used for example, for EU REACH purposes, because it does not transfer automatically to UK REACH. So you cannot use EU REACH data automatically for UK REACH purposes. You would have to, in many cases, most cases, pay for that data again. So they're trying to avoid this by coming up with this new registration approach. And this is still work and discussions ongoing, so please take it with a grain of salt. This may change a bit still, and information is fairly scarce on this topic. But if you go to the next slide. So the first change is that for certain substances, you would be able to, instead of submitting a full registration dossier, you would be able to submit the so-called substance hazard information profile. And this means that you would compile this SHIP with publicly available information, and also in this SHIP agree on a hazard profile for the substance. So the idea is that you collect all the freely available data that is available and demonstrate that the substance properties has been properly assessed, and then documented in this SHIP. And this SHIP will then be submitted to the HSC for some kind of review. And to our understanding, this would be done on a substance group level. So a substance group is a group of companies who are intending to register the same substance. In EU REACH, we talked about SIEVs, but for UK REACH, they're called substance groups. It is not clear yet, will they use the Euclid 6 tool to develop this SHIP or not? Will it be some sort of other free format? But this is still to be discussed and to be agreed. If they're using this iEuclid, they would need a new profile under this, a new template per se. So if you take the next slide. So also very good to understand that this SHIP only applies to certain substances that are not deemed to be of concern to the UK. However, for substances that are considered as being of concern to the UK, this definition is not clear yet. You would have to still fulfill and submit the full data set as you would do for EU REACH. So basically according to the current legal text. So next slide, please. Then they're also looking at this sort of a specific risk assessment. Sometimes they mention it as an individual CSR, whereby they would provide this at a very focused look at the specific GB uses and these exposures, and it would be a very narrow focus compared to the EU one, which has a very broad generic approach. So the idea was that you would have to include quite a lot of specific data, such as data and data tonnages per use, who your customers are, essentially what the sites are, and so forth. So at the moment, it is not clear whether this is done jointly or individually. I think at worst, it would be prepared as a template jointly and then submitted individually. And apparently there also talk about being able to provide a so-called confidential and a non-confidential version of this. Presumably this non-confidential version would be then available to the public, to be determined still, of course. But the thing is that this may apply to substances from 1 ton upwards. So if you remember, for EU REACH, the CSR only applies for substances at over 10 tons annually, and then on top of that you have to provide an exposure assessment if it is hazardous. So this might mean that for low volume substances you would have to also provide this. But as said, this is conjecture at the moment, very preliminary information. So if you take the next slide, please. And the biggest thing that people seem to be excited about is the fact that the registration deadlines are being changed. So we know for, I would say, a fact that the first deadline will surely be changed. So meaning postponed. So nothing will be registered in October next year. So they're looking at different approaches. They're looking at the 2-year extension across the board. So it means that all these deadlines that we looked upon previously that are included in the current legal text would be just postponed with a flat 2-year. So you would have 25, 27, and 29 as the registration deadlines, depending on the tonnage band of the substance and the hazard profiles as we looked upon earlier. This might, however, be a bit too tight, so they've also looked at the version whereby they just add 3 years to all of these, but then the last deadline would go into the next decade, which is probably not a good thing, and likely there would be environmental groups and so forth who are not very happy with this approach. So if you take the next slide, please. So what they're also looking at is what we call a compressed approach. So it means that the first deadline would be postponed by 3 years, the next one with 2, and the last one with just 1 year. So that would keep all the deadlines in this decade. So I think this may be a reasonable, most likely outcome to be determined, or maybe there's something else. But this is what we know at the moment. We know that the first one will at least be postponed. So if you take the next slide, please. And as said for the previous slides, these are all still under discussion, so things may change. So if you want to follow this process, then actually there will be a formal brief public consultation in the summer. And then in the fall, they will publish a report on this public consultation, which probably at this stage we will know much more of the practical implications of this new registration approach. But what they're looking at is to actually amend the regulation so that it comes into force in 2024. So this already means that the first registration deadline cannot be earlier than 2024, and likely will not be in 2024 because then companies will not have enough time to react. So likely it will be postponed with 2 years or more, at least the first deadline. So if they take the next slide, please. Okay, so that actually concludes my part. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and sorry for going probably a bit over time. And there you see my contact details if you have any like confidential questions that you want to ask specific to your business, obviously.
Many thanks, Frederik. We don't have any questions so far. I have a number that I can bring at the end for sure.
Sure.
But thanks a lot. I think it was very clear and very hot out of the oven with a number of latest news as well. And Silvia will take us through these upcoming changes again. So Silvia, I would like to give you the floor basically because we know that the Chemical Industries Association has been advocating very strongly with the UK REACH authorities, DEFRA and HSE. For example, I know you have been asking to simplify the registration approach to reduce the costs, a bit what Frederik explained, and the CIA has been in direct contact with DEFRA for a number of years now to try to make something workable out of the UK REACH. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Silvia.
Thank you, Caroline. Just asking if you can see me because I not.
Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, I hope you can hear me well as well.
Perfect.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, so you asked me to give short overview of our activities and around the developments that CIA is pushing for or we are anticipating around UK REACH. So just as background information, last year CIA along with other 25 associations representing chemicals, chemical supply chains, and some of the key manufacturing sectors, we wrote to the government and calling for an alternative UK REACH regime for registration. And this was in response to the concerns raised by industry leaders around the financial significance of not reaching a specific arrangement for chemicals, specifically around data sharing and REACH, as part of the UK-EU trade and cooperation agreement. So it was February that we submitted a working proposal to the UK government to encourage the UK authority to allow those companies that were dealing already in EU REACH register supply chains to continue to do so without having to submit again registrations in the UK, while allowing the UK authority to prioritize and regulate chemicals needing further assessment, for example, making use of information publicly available, and of course the information through the notification process, but still allowing the UK authority to require full data sets, dossiers for substances the UK determine a need for further information. So whilst our proposal has been received with reservations from the government side, on the basis that it would shift responsibility to assess risks posed by chemicals from industry back to the authority, the good thing was that the cost issue and around data access was recognized by the government. And here is the recent announcement that was mentioned by Frederik about the intention of the government to explore the potential for a new model for UK REACH transition and registrations and to extend the registration timeline. So I'm mentioning this just to clarify and making sure there are no misunderstandings, is that the proposal from the government that we will see shortly is something that is being designed by the government. So this is not the original industry proposal that was put forward. So it's really a model that is being developed by the government. So since the announcement, the discussions with UK officials we've had so far really indicate the willingness from the regulator side to find a more efficient approach with registration, but they made clear that the burden of providing information remain with industry. So this is really a key, aspect. So the model that is currently being considered by the government, as Frederik already mentioned, would see businesses preparing and submitting hazard information via the so-called substance groups, followed by individual companies carrying out register and specific risk assessments in a GB context. At this stage, details of the government proposal are still to be developed, and engagement from the government side has not, started yet, as far as CIA is knows is involved with. So we are not, CIA, in a position to speculate on the details of what companies will be required to do in future. What we know is that the registration timelines will be extended, and this will be done to allow the UK authority to assess the viability of the registration model. So, as already mentioned, a formal government proposal for the deadlines extensions will be published soon and will be subject to public consultation. Then the alternative registration model, if viable, would then require an additional legislative instrument, but this will happen, as far as we know, in a second step, and at present we are unable to provide an indication around, for example, a formal consultation will happen on that specific aspects of the, what the legislation will require. But officials from what we understand are very keen to ensure that industry have at least minimum 2 years to prepare for the first registration deadline for the moment the legislation on the alternative registration model is put in place. So the expectation is that the first registration deadline will be set according to the latest information in 2026. So this is a good development. So companies will have time to prepare for it. But from an industry perspective, from CIA perspective, determining the appropriate registration deadlines then depends, of course, in great part by the amount of work and the resources that will be required by the registration model that is ultimately agreed. And currently there is quite a high degree of uncertainty. We support, of course, the option that was mentioned by Frederik, that one with registrations in 2026, 28, and 2030. And our member companies have made clear to us that a 2-year interval space between deadlines would still be needed to allow a wider spread of resources as well as cost. And especially if, for example, the provision of a new specific GB risk assessment may also need to be factored in 1 year between the deadline, as per the option mentioned in 2006, 26, 27, and 28, may be quite challenging and perhaps not very realistic in terms of time frame. So we've been quite busy in last couple of months to look at this subject of the registration extensions, and we passed some initial views and messages from our member companies back to DEFRA on this point, and we are looking really forward to see how the formal proposal from the government will look like in relation to the deadline extensions. Then with respect to the alternative registration model itself, of course, the focus on reducing the cost associated with obtaining the data package that is needed, for registration purposes by industry is, of course, a welcome step forward. However, I would say the expectations that industry will use, for example, publicly available data for registration, in our view, will need to be clarified going forward from at least a legal point of view, as, for example, aspects such as copyrights, database rights, will likely to be relevant in one way or another in shaping clear hazard information requirements, for example, under the SHIP model. So legal aspects around data sharing, data ownership, intellectual properties, and use of disseminating information, in our view, need to be addressed while the model will be developed. So this is a really key point that our member companies want to see addressed and clearly understood by the government. And then beyond considerations on the registration timeframe, as well as the alternative model, our members are very keen to making sure that we look at the workability of the IT system and the clarity around requirements for substance groups being equally important, I would say. So, for example, as already mentioned by Frederik, from this initial information that we're hearing from the government, it's clear that we'll still have to use substance groups to agree on hazard profile for chemicals and for the submission of the initial set of information. And also companies will likely still need to appoint a lead registrant in this case. So given the timeline, even if it's extended, the first registration deadline by 3 years, then the successful formation of substance groups, for example, and the allocation of a lead registrant will still partly dictate a timely data submission to the HSE. So, there is a whole issue around visibility that we believe that still need to be addressed. For example, some further consideration, for example, could be given to allow possible registrant to be visible within substance groups and to facilitate the allocation of the lead registrant. And this perhaps could involve some changes of functionality, for example, into the IT system that would allow the identification of the appointed lead registrants as early as possible, and for sure prior to the dossier submission. That is a facility that is not in place today yet, because actually, the role can be claimed only after the submission of the dossier. Yes, so the message that we get from companies is that UK substance groups cannot be set up in an efficient way if they are only made of companies that are just grandfathered or submitting an inquiry, and it's really not very practical. The current facility we have around claiming the lead registrant role. So these are other points that we are trying to address, and we produce a position document that is available on our website, highlighting some of the issues that companies are experiencing in setting up substance group and preventing the good functioning. So yes, these are really 3 key points I wanted to mention today around the extension of the deadline, I would say the alternative registration model, and the practical, I would say, implementation issues around substance groups. And yes, we are really very keen to see this engagement on the alternative registration model to start as soon as possible. So in this way, the sooner industry will be in the position to plan for registration. Thank you.
Many thanks, Silvia. Thank you very much. I really like the flow of these presentations. Frederik gave a kind of a aperitif, and then Silvia puts the cherry on the cake. So it was a really nice clarification for all of us not following the UK REACH developments on a day-to-day basis like you are doing. What I like maybe to bring, we don't have many questions, but one thing I would like to bring maybe is that maybe the SHIP, so this substance hazard information profile, could be something indeed that we could produce for our precious metals, especially those who are not hazardous, not classified, and maybe even to be discussed, of course, try to stop it there. Basically saying, because they are not hazardous, they are not classified, why should these companies produce the registrant-specific exposure data and use data submission? If DEFRA is open to simplify the system and avoid burden on both industry but also on their side, because we know they have difficulties recruiting all the people they need to manage UK REACH, maybe that's an opportunity for LBMA members actually to fight for a simplified approach for these precious metals who are actually non-hazardous, and we could help them actually going there. I had a question regarding the transitional measures for Frederik or for Silvia. What if companies actually did not have an active trade in 2019, 2020 and still submit a DUIN? I've experienced this with many companies who said, well, we had something, but not in our name, or we had something via. It would take a little bit of time to put it together, but in the worst case, to be covered, we actually submitted DUIN. Do you think that with the available resources HSE and DEFRA have, they will actually go back at these companies, or they will just be happy to have a DUIN for a substance as simple, I would say, as a precious metal, for example? What do you expect the enforcement level would be on that specific part of the regulation?
Well, I can start. So obviously, if you are not eligible for these transitional measures and you submit the DUIN, then obviously you're not compliant with the UK REACH regulation. So I would in these situations, if you go forward with this DUIN, I'm pretty sure no one will ever find out, because there's no easy way for the HSE or any authorities to check this. The only thing is that, for example, if there's a compliance audit or something like that, then this is where you would potentially be caught. Our recommendation is, of course, in these situations whereby you submitted a DUIN, which essentially is void in this case, I would contact the HSE. They've proven to be very pragmatic, understanding of the difficulties companies may have in applying these new requirements. So I would contact the HSE, and of course, in parallel, prepare for submitting an inquiry and this deferred registration, because doing these is not that big of a deal, to be honest. If you registered for EU REACH, you have the analytical information already available. So that is essentially the only information you would need to submit these two documents. Of course, bearing in mind that when you submit the deferred registration, or sometimes called an NRES, you need to pay the HSE registration fee. So that would be I would say, the biggest. But in your case, I think the volumes are very small, so I think it would not be a big cost that either. That would be my recommendation. Silvia, do you have anything to add?
I fully agree with what you suggested, Frederik. I've just had the point that we've seen some, pragmatic approaches from the HSE. For example, even if there was not active trade during 2019, 2020, but the GB company was using that chemical without importing it during that window, they would still have permitted a DUIN to be submitted. So I think they clarified in some of the responses that we submitted to the HSE help desk that that was okay to submit a queuing, providing the company, the company that used to be a downstream user and today is a UK importer, was actually using the chemical during 2019 or 2020, but without specifically importing the chemical in that time frame. So just an addition to that point. And then otherwise I agree, the HSE has always been pragmatic in enforcing REACH whilst we were part of the EU, and don't believe, at least we also recently heard that there's no plan to change the approach they take to enforcement. So we'll still be pragmatic and risk-based. And if a company is not compliant, the advice is to really contact HSE and they will help bring the company to go back to compliance. Thanks.
Thank you, Silvia. It's really good to hear that indeed the UK HSE is very pragmatic, and actually that's a very big loss for EU systems that the
Yes.
UK authorities have left the table, because they were really the most pragmatic people on. So maybe in order to close the webinar, because we're reaching the hour, I want to really thank all of you for the excellent contributions, very really eye-opening. There is a lot of things still to happen. We are actually hearing about a number of documents being published with associated consultations. DEFRA will also be organizing stakeholder workshops that will be announced as they go. So of course, LBMA members will be informed about that. Also, otherwise, you have the REACHLaw talks, you have the Chemical Watch UK Chemicals Regulations of 2022 that is taking place next week. And as you see, this is really changing. What we would like to suggest is maybe that we meet again about this topic later, around in September. Why? First, because as you heard, many things will have changed and become a bit more concrete under UK REACH, but also the EU REACH will have changed as well. A number of things are changing in EU REACH, and as there is this intention to match UK REACH and EU REACH, we have to be aware of that. And so by meeting later in the year, we'll be able to actually bring these double changes together for your information. So with this, I would like, oh, my computer stopped working. Yeah, I would like to give the floor to Emmy and Taylor to close this workshop. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Caroline. So as Caroline has mentioned, there are so much still going on with UK REACH and EU REACH. So if you would like to make sure that you're on the mailing list for those, do get in touch. I'm sure Taylor will mention the email address at the end. Likewise, there are so many resources on our website. If you are having trouble finding those, give us a shout. We have guidance documents that Caroline has kindly put together over on the My LBMA website, so just for members. But yes, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, do get in touch if you have any further questions. We're here to help, and we can put you in touch with Caroline if you do need that extra support to get this across the line. So over to you, Taylor.
Great, thank you everyone. Thank you to our panelists, Caroline, Frederik and Silvia and Emmy as well for joining us. We very much appreciated having you with us. If you did have any questions throughout the webinar, again, if you joined us live or if you are watching this back recorded, send us an email at ask@lbma.org.uk and we'll make sure that they get to our panelists and we can give you some much needed questions. Answers to your questions. I know I do have a few, but these experts will be able to clear up any questions that you may have. So again, thank you, and thank you to our attendees. Before we leave, I'm just going to run through a few upcoming webinars and events that we do have. As Caroline did mention, we will plan to have another REACH webinar in September. So I believe that will be on the 20th. So mark your calendars. We'll have more information on that in due course, so keep your eyes peeled. If we could move on to the next slide, that would be very amazing. The one after that. Thank you very much. We have a webinar again in 2 days. So we have Jim Steele, Suki Cooper and Rona O'Connell, 3 of our Public Affairs Committee members, giving a webinar on inflation, central bank policies and the macroeconomy. They'll be touching on many topics and basically how those topics are affected by those in the subject title of the webinar. So if you haven't registered for that already, I recommend that you do. Following that, in June, we have 2 training dates. So on the 9th and 10th, we have an introduction to Loco London and how to use Loco London respectively. So if you have any questions about what is on the course, what is taught, or how you can actually get yourself on the course, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. And a little bit of a save the date for the 7th of July, LBMA's annual general meeting for our members. More information will follow, but again, save the date. I think that's all I have to let you know. But again, if you have any questions, just reach out. So a final thank you. If you want to go to the next slide as well, please, Emmy, if you do want to know any more about LBMA, you can head along to our website or any of our social media profiles. So thank you and have an absolutely wonderful afternoon.